We're joined this evening by a very, very special guest speaker and keynote to kick us off. She comes from a very famous family in American politics. Her grandfather served as the mayor of Baltimore. Her mother, who you may know or will probably get some exposure to here soon, was the first female elected by her colleagues as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Christine Nancy Pelosi. Our speaker this evening is her daughter, Christine, who in her own right is an accomplished speaker, author, democratic activist, and has published several books, and one of which we are going to be gifting to all of you as our participants. It's her most recent book entitled Campaign Bootcamp 2.0, Basic Training for Candidates, Staffers, Volunteers, and Nonprofits. So Christine would have loved to have been here in person with us, but we'll have to settle for Zoom for now. And she's wanting to hear from you guys as much as she intends to share her perspectives and experiences from across the country. What's really worked for candidates' campaigns, and maybe more importantly, in a lot of situations, what hasn't worked. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Christine Pelosi. Thank you so much for being with us, Christine. Aloha.
Aloha, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be with you. I thought we'd be here together live. Actually, 2 years ago this month, I was in Hawaii during MLK weekend, and it was so beautiful. Tomorrow we marched with the unions and rode on a cable car. If any of you may have seen that or were a part of that, the cable car ride that we did on Martin Luther King Day, it was really special and wonderful. I had come out at the invitation of the Patsy Mink PAC, and I had actually known Congresswoman Patsy Mink because when I worked on Capitol Hill, my boss was on the Education and Labor Committee, so working with both Congresswoman Mink and Congressman Neil Abercrombie. And of course, everybody, we loved Congresswoman Mink, but especially when it was our boss's birthday, because she would always give her colleagues chocolate-covered macadamia nuts for their birthday. So that was always a staff treat. But in any event, I'm very sorry that I'm not in Hawaii. Maybe I'll be able to come out for graduation. Wrangling myself an invitation here. But what I do think is really important, and I'm so glad that to be able to talk with you today about tonight, is really your call to service. When we talked about being partners in democracy and what that means, what we need now more than ever before. We know that our democracy is at risk on a large scale because of the threats that are out there from people who've decided that if they don't like an election, they're just going to create a big lie around it. If they don't like the electors sent to Washington, D.C. to certify the election of the President of the United States, they'll just fill out some fake forms and send them with fake electors. If they don't like the Vice President and the Speaker of the House certifying the vote, they will try to take over the Capitol and hunt them down and assassinate them in order to get what they want. It is a terrible, terrible thing that happened on January 6th for two reasons. One, because of the threat near and dear to our members of Congress, President and Vice President of the United States, but on the custodians, the staff, the Capitol Police, all that, but also because of what it said about the state of our democracy, where we have prided ourselves as Americans that since the Civil War, we said, no, we confer power with ballots, not bullets, and that should not change. And so as we look and see what happened on January 6th and how we can prevent that from happening again, we also talk about needing partners in democracy at the very, very intimate individual level, which is, given the ugliness of partisan politics, and I know it better than most, and given the struggle that it can take to convince people to step outside of their comfort zones, to get out of their bubbles and actually work together, do we want to even get involved? So the first thing that you did by coming tonight was to answer both of those questions, that you want to work for a more perfect union and our American democracy, but also that you wanted to get out of your individual bubbles and comfort zones and come be with a group of strangers and who will become friends, who will be part of your political family as you move forward. And that's a really important step. So I thank you for that. One of the things that I've been doing since I left Capitol Hill as a chief of staff in 2005 is that up until COVID, I had spent 15 years on the road. I would travel around, I'd work with a lot of unions. I'm based out of AFSCME. We worked on a congressional candidates boot camp for 15 years. We traveled the country. We trained people to run for office, not just for Congress, where many of our candidates were successful as majority makers, but also worked with people on how to have more power within the union, how to have more power within their communities, how to be better advocates for working families. So it was through that work that I met Tyler DeSantos Tom, first with the Young Democrats of Hawaii, and now as the chair of the Hawaii Democratic Party. He's the one who connected me to you all and said, this is a group of people you're going to like because they're entering this arena and they're very excited about doing so. And they want to hear some stories and get some tips, but mostly talk amongst themselves about the ways in which they can make a difference for other people. So what I wanted to do as we began is just to give you a little bit of insight. When I do this boot camp, I've been to 4 foreign countries, 41 states, and the message is always the same. It begins with, what is your call to service? What drives you into public life? As a volunteer, as an activist, as a staffer, as a potential candidate, or as a candidate. But something, as Will was mentioning, something had you leave your communities tonight, your family, even if you were just walking into another room and closing the door, as I did. Something brought us together tonight, and that's our call to service. For me, it's advancing the cause of Democrats and democracy, little d Democrats and democracy, making sure that people get engaged, that people are informed, and that people who decide that they want to engage in public service are able to learn some of the things that I've learned traveling the country over the past several years, and that is how it is that we reach across the partisan divides, the intrapartisan divides, and the personal divides between people to try to get things done, to try to do things in an effective way, to make sure that working people are building power together, and to make sure that, from my perspective, more women, more people of color, more LGBTQ people are being elected to office so that power looks different. That picture behind me is actually a painting that an artist did based off a photograph of my mom when she was a teenager and JFK. Now, a lot of people thought that he was going to be president of the United States. Nobody thought that that teenager, whose father was mayor of Baltimore and who was attending the event as a high school member of the Friends of the United Nations, would be in elective office, much less the Speaker of the House of Representatives. But history isn't a great leap to power. It's the steps that you take with your neighbors and your friends and your families for your values along the way. And so I think that when you the first step is to say, well, what draws you to service? What draws you to serve? What is your call to service? When you think about why you were here, when you filled out your application and you wrote your essay and you asked people to be references for you, what did you say about yourself? And when you asked people to be references, probably it was because, although you might have used different terms, you knew that they knew you. You knew that they knew your call to service, your purpose, your why, and your strengths as a person. And I think knowing that about yourself, knowing what issues you care about the most, knowing how you work with people. Are you an executive type? Are you an advocate type? Can you try out a little bit of both? Knowing whether you have a people skill, a paper skill, or a physical skill, and what other sorts of skills you want to build up around that. Really the nuts and bolts of working to advance your ideas. That all is part of what informs your call to service. So it's not just why you joined this program, although I'm curious to get your questions and your perspectives about that, but also what it is that you want to be thinking about, working on, working in community about. There's a lot of issues that we all care about. And there's some issues that are so intensely personal that perhaps you don't want to bring them into the public sphere. But building power, building systems, building community, all of that takes a deep connection to what you care about. And it also takes the humility to know when you need to step back and re-examine the way that you do things. So I'll conclude this introductory part with giving you a little bit of my story. I have always worked in democratic politics, but in particular have been drawn to advocacy for women and girls. And when I was out of law school, it was actually started when I was in law school, and then right out of law school, I worked on the board of a nonprofit called Legal Services for Children, where we advocated for children in the dependency, criminal, and immigration courts in San Francisco, because oftentimes all three court systems were engaged with foster children. And so we made a point of having a lawyer and a social worker work with each child and navigate them through the different systems. And then I went to work in the city attorney's office and then the district attorney's office in the domestic violence and sexual assault unit. And in prosecuting those cases and working on those cases, I came to work on systemic changes, which then brought me to work at HUD under the Clinton Gore administration as a special counsel at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where we were working on continuum of care. So it wasn't just housing people, it was making sure they had wraparound services so that they could stay in housing and build stable families. And from there, I worked on Capitol Hill as the chief of staff, largely on issues of healthcare and national security and veterans. And then starting in 2005, working on these boot camps, training people to run for office, trying to share some of the things that I knew, also being elected for 10 years as the chair of the California Democratic Party Women's Caucus, and working as an elected member of the Democratic National Committee on the Veterans and Military Families Council, and most recently to help establish a disabilities caucus within the DNC. So I do a lot of work with people who are in vulnerable communities or people who have been in service in one way or another in the military or in social work or in legal work, and try to encourage them to take those experiences and run for either party office or elective office. And particularly, I think, because I work so much with veterans and in communities that are dealing with climate or disability or healthcare and domestic violence, those are not partisan issues. They happen in every family, in every community, regardless of political party. And so the solutions for that have to be nonpartisan as well. I personally think that it's been my experience that you have more resources directed at them when there are Democrats in power, but that also requires that you have Democrats who believe in labor unions, who believe in lifting up working people. So again, there are some cross currents there for me that aren't exclusively partisan. I would say part of my success as a partisan Democrat is the fact that I work on nonpartisan issues and always get that reality check from independents and Republicans in the various coalitions on which I am active. So when I chaired the Democratic Party Women's Caucus, we had always been a very big supporter as a caucus of women who would come forward, including a lot of women who would come forward and speak about the sexism at our state capitol and in our campaigns, where men and women would work on campaigns, but it was always the men that were paid more. It was always the men that were saying, hey, you should run for office, and the women, well, you should be a staffer to the person running for office. And so when the whole Me Too movement kicked off, I was part of a group that was asked to be start a Me Too politics, sign a letter and help get advocacy and laws changed. And so we started a group, wrote a letter, and we said enough. We said enough was our group, and we thought we'd write our letter, we would complain, and then these legislators whom we had helped elect, whose stories we knew, we'd all make this change together and say, well, we may have done some toxic things. I'm a former smoker. I compared it to, well, we all used to smoke. Now we don't smoke anymore because we've learned better, and we've learned that secondhand smoke is very bad for other people. So let's just change our behavior together. And the pushback was so severe. It was shocking to me. Here, I thought I knew all this about politics, but I was not emotionally prepared for how entrenched power was and how much people really didn't want to change. It was almost, it came to a fore one day, though, because there was a woman who had been at one of my women's caucuses and then afterwards had been sexually assaulted by someone in her cohort. And it was terrible. And as it turns out later, he worked for a female legislator who came back and spoke to the caucus. And as much as I thought I was this great advocate for women, we had to have a real meeting brokered by somebody else where she said, I thought you knew my story and I thought you didn't believe me because you had this woman come speak. Well, I didn't know her assaulter. I didn't know her assaulter's boss. But for me, it was a real lesson that no matter how much of a good advocate I thought I was, no matter how morally clear I thought my actions were, there was still more for me to learn. And there was still not only more information for me to process, but it made me realize that when I do my advocacy, I never quite know my audience. You think you know it, you can research it to a certain point, but in the end, you don't really know what's going on in people's lives. So you have to be willing to be open enough for them to tell their story and to tell their story in a very critical way. Sometimes the feedback, I'm on Twitter at SF Pelosi. You can find me. I'm fully engaged and have no problem doing that, but they're largely because a lot of women don't. So I feel a need to do that. So when I think of my call to service, I'm very clear on what I want to do and how I want to fight and what lines I'm not willing to cross as far as my advocacy is concerned, especially because I take care to remember that I'm a lawyer and what I might advocate for myself is different from what my clients might want. But I would say that it has been my experience over the years that because I know that this is my touchstone, I am constantly aware of the responsibility that I have as a woman with a high profile to stick up for other women who don't have my profile, and in some cases to push an envelope where other women would not be able to do that. And so that is a bit about me, my call to service, and also my call to step forward and sometimes to step back as I'm engaged in that. So one of the things that I hope we can talk a little bit more about tonight, and based on your questions, is what is your call to service? How is it that you find it? How is that honed for you? And what are the ways in which you think that this cohort might help get you there? So with that, I did want to share a slide. Do you want to put that up for the group so we can think about it?
Yep, coming right up.
We have it? Okay, thank you. Here you all are. Let's see if we can look at this slide because it's a way to think about what you want to do. So we call it message boxing. So many of you have probably heard of the late Senator Paul Wellstone. He was the person who I knew who first used this message box, and we'd used it for years. But he's the most first Senate campaign that had used it. And when you think about a message box, when we're doing a classic message development, we talk about what we think about ourselves, what the opposition thinks about itself, and then what we say about them, what they say about us. And then underneath it, and as you go through the cohort, some of this will make more sense, but just to give you a broad overview, we think, okay, first I develop my message, and then what I think, who are my advocates or allies, my message multipliers, what money might I use, what mobilization or metrics might I have to get my message out. So when you're doing a call to service message box, it's a little bit different because you're not running against somebody else. In effect, you're running against yourself. You're running against your own self-doubt. So if I say, what I say about me is, I want to be a strong advocate for women and girls, then the person I would consider, the entity I consider the opponent might be apathy, right? What makes you think you can do it? Self-doubt. Why are you out there talking? Where are you? What gives you any expertise at all to talk about this? Why should people listen to you? And by the way, why do we really need that, right? And so then I would say, well, what I would say about the self-doubt is, well, too many times people who have been victims of domestic violence or sexual violence are silenced, and the culture of silence, of know your place, be lucky just to be at the table, don't say anything, that if we perpetuate that and we don't speak out, then we won't be able to give women, the leaders, the courage they need to come forward. And, you know, what someone might say in response to that is, well, that's true, but if you identify as a feminist, you're going to scare away all the men. So when I am doing some messaging, particularly around We Said Enough, you know, the Me Too type messaging, I'm always aware, first of all, that speaking out is a privilege I have. It does mean I will close some doors, right? That self-doubt there, right there, right? That why are you doing this? If you call out the culture in a campaign or at a state capitol, they may not want you to work there. They may not want you to run for office and serve there. They may not want to help you or listen to you when you go up and talk to them. That is real, and that's something to consider. How I would fill out the box down here, what they say about you. Another one would be, why are you painting all the men with a bad brush, right? And I would say to that, well, I'm not. I have, there are many, supportive men who are doing this, but in the end, statistically speaking, it's men who hold most of the power, and it's women who don't, and it's men who tend to be more believed and women who are not. And so that's why we have to rebalance the scales there. And we're not saying that all men are bad or that we shouldn't elect only men. We're saying we need to have diversity in the mix. And that's the ultimate one that I'd come back to here in this final little box here in terms of what I would say about them is it's fine for, the status quo may have worked for some people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And that's why I need to step in this arena and be competent that I can bring other people with me, particularly other people from formerly underrepresented communities, or people who may have been elected but haven't been in leadership, people who have been able to speak but haven't been heard. And so just as an example of that, before we go to questions, let's look at the news that we got today that President Biden is going to name Stephen Breyer's nominee, and she is going to be a highly qualified, ethical, talented Black woman. So that's what President Biden is saying in that first box. What are we already hearing? Why are we doing that? You're only doing that because you're checking a box for a Black woman. You're not doing that because she's the most qualified. And what they will say is we, the Senate as a whole, gets to decide who gets to be a Supreme Court justice. Don't think that just because you're the president, we're automatically going to give you a vote. We heard that a few years ago. So what we would say in response down here and what they say about you is you're just checking a box. And what we have to respond here, this is really the most important box right here. What we say about them, it's really our counter argument where we will say, no, what you need to do is respect that America is changing, that representation matters, and that a leader isn't just the same kind of people who've always been on the courts, but it's really everybody. And that, of course, includes Black women, and that's why we need that representation. And by the way, to be a Black woman who's even eligible to be considered to being a member of the United States Supreme Court, to being the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, she's better be a damn good lawyer, because she probably got all these things said about her, all of those things directed at her all along the way, and she managed to succeed. So that is, I think, that's just an example. I would encourage each of you to do this message box in your own time about your goals and what you think, what you put in that negative box. Is it apathy? Is it self-doubt? Is it maybe doubt or resistance that you got, from your coworkers or for a family member or for people, your friends who are like, well, who cares about politics? Why would you go do this on a Thursday night, right? And then where we think the doubt is coming from, right? Their strongest argument is because nothing will really change. You can't make change. And then really, tee it up for yourself here in that last box. What are you going to say to your doubting self? What are you going to say to your doubting friends? What are you going to say to your apathetic people? When I wrote my book, my first book, actually, and you'll pardon my language, but I'm just quoting my editor. He said, I'm a half-assed joiner, so write it for someone like me. Why should I join? Why should I care? So hopefully as we go forward tonight and throughout, you go throughout this program, you'll be able to take a look at your answers to questions and your motivations and think, I'm shadowboxing something. I'm taking on doubt. I'm taking on fear. I'm taking on apathy. And it's worth it because I don't have to accept the status quo, and I don't have to accept that nothing will really change. And I can, in fact, convince people that there is a different way of doing things, my way of doing things, and I can teach myself along the way to do them even better. So with that, should we take some questions?